They sentenced a decorated soldier to prison without ever hearing his side of the story, until he stood up and asked to speak. What he said next made the courtroom fall silent and the jury wipe their eyes. Interested in the story? Keep on watching and let me know where you are watching from. Sergeant Elias Ward stood silent as the courtroom buzzed around him, the word guilty slicing through the air like a bullet he never saw coming. The judge's voice echoed in his ears, but the words blurred under the weight of a single truth. This was how it would end. His hands stayed loose at his sides, his jaw locked tight, but inside something cracked. Not loudly, quietly, like the slow splintering of a foundation built too long on silence. He had stood in snipers' nests under fire. He had felt the wind shift before death came, but nothing prepared him for this moment. The sting of betrayal wrapped in a judge's robe and 12 uncertain faces. They believed he had betrayed his oath, his brothers, his country, that he had acted alone, pulled a trigger that didn't need pulling, taken a life that didn't deserve taking. They hadn't seen the hill, the chaos. The orders shouted in a blur of sand and blood. They hadn't seen the look in the lieutenant's eyes when he said, "Take the shot, Ward, now." But that wasn't what mattered in this room. Not truth, not loyalty, just perception. Elias swallowed hard, refusing to show the devastation clawing up his throat. His eyes flicked to the gallery, scanning the faces. Press, families, strangers. Some wept. Some glared. Most just watched, waiting to see what the so-called rogue soldier would do. He found no familiar eyes, no allies. The ones who knew had stayed quiet, forced to by NDAs or fear. The ones who didn't know had filled in the blanks with guesses, politics, headlines. The judge's gavel slammed down, sealing it. Elias Ward, honorably discharged, twice decorated, now convicted of manslaughter in the field, was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. No parole, no leniency. The courtroom shifted into motion around him, but he didn't move. Not yet. The bailiff approached, cuffs ready, and still he stood there, grounded not in pride but in disbelief. Not because he hadn't expected this, but because some part of him still hoped. That someone would stand, that someone would say, "You don't know what he gave up." But no one did. So he turned his eyes to the floor, where his boots had once stood on foreign soil, steady beneath the weight of comrades depending on him. And in that moment, in the deafening quiet that followed justice misfired, Elias made a decision. They had taken his name, his rank, his record, but they would not take his voice. Not yet. As the bailiff approached with cuffs, Elias didn't flinch. The cold metal wrapped around his wrists with a finality that felt heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. His shoulders remained square, head held high, but his eyes didn't rise to meet anyone's. The room blurred around him, suits shifting uncomfortably, journalists scribbling as if his life were just another headline, old comrades looking away with guilt stitched into every glance. He wasn't angry. He was hollow. Not the kind of emptiness that comes from loss, but the deeper kind, the kind that comes from betrayal so familiar it no longer surprises you. He thought about the men he'd served with, the ones who had bled beside him, the ones who never came home. He thought about promises made in the dirt, whispered over dying bodies, promises to protect, to honor, to never lie about what happened out there. And yet here he stood, bound in a courtroom 1,000 miles from the battlefield, condemned not by the enemy, but by the very people he had sworn to defend. He heard someone whisper his name, soft, like regret. But he didn't look. He didn't want to know which face it came from. He stared straight ahead as the bailiff tugged gently at his elbow, guiding him toward the door like a ghost already fading. The truth, buried beneath headlines and politics, had no place in this room. It hadn't mattered that the mission was off the books, that the rules had changed without warning. It hadn't mattered that the man he shot had been carrying more than just a weapon. The only thing that mattered now was that a body fell and a camera caught the aftermath. And someone had to be held accountable. Elias had been the easiest target, the convenient one, the sniper who didn't flinch, the soldier who followed orders. And now, this was his legacy. Not the lives he saved, not the men he carried off the field, not the night he stood between an ambush and his entire unit. No, this moment, in chains, with the world watching and no one speaking, would be what they remembered. He felt the cuffs tighten as he stepped past the gallery, and for a split second, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the glass doors. He barely recognized the man staring back. Uniform stripped of its dignity, eyes tired but unbroken. A soldier without a war, a hero without a home. But deep inside, beneath the ache, something still burned. Quiet. Waiting. Not for revenge, not for rage, but for the right moment to speak. To tell the truth. One last time. Before they could drag him away, Elias raised his voice, low, steady, but edged with something raw. "Your Honor, permission to speak." The words cut through the murmurs, halting the shuffle of papers and the scraping of chairs. The bailiff paused mid-step, grip still on Elias's arm. The judge, a stern man who hadn't flinched once during the trial, blinked. He studied Elias for a long moment, weighing the request not as a legal formality, but as something heavier, something unexpected. Then with a slow nod, he said, "Proceed, Sergeant." A ripple of confusion ran through the courtroom, whispers rising from the jury box, heads turning in the gallery. Elias didn't look at them. He turned slowly, hands still cuffed in front of him, the chain clinking softly with each movement. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't here to beg. He had nothing to bargain with and nothing left to lose. What he wanted was simple. He wanted them to hear him, just once. His voice carried without force, calm but deliberate. "I didn't come here to defend myself. I already lost that battle, not because I'm guilty, but because the truth was too heavy to fit into your boxes, too complicated to make the news." No one interrupted. Not the judge, not the prosecutors. Even the courtroom stenographer had paused, eyes wide, her fingers hovering above the keys. Elias shifted slightly, meeting the eyes of the jury, the same 12 people who had chosen to believe a version of events dressed in sound bites and omissions. "You saw what they showed you," he continued. "A single moment frozen on a screen, a decision made in the blur of combat, stripped of context, stripped of blood, stripped of fear. You were never given the rest." His jaw clenched as he swallowed hard. "You never heard the radio chatter. You didn't smell the burning metal or feel the heat of bodies breaking around you. You didn't carry the weight of the call when command went silent, and I had to choose between waiting and losing everyone, or acting and living with this." His voice cracked then, just a little, but he didn't look away. "I chose wrong. Or maybe I chose right, but I chose, and I've carried it every damn day since." The courtroom had gone utterly still. No one wrote, no one whispered. Even the judge leaned forward, slightly, elbows on the bench, listening not as a man of the law, but as a man. Elias drew in a shaky breath. "That's all I wanted. Not forgiveness, just the truth. You don't have to believe me, but now at least you've heard me." He turned to the jury, the people who had decided his fate without ever knowing his story. They had watched him from behind their perfect lives, far from the sand and blood where his truth had been written. Now he looked at them not with anger, but with the weight of all the nights he never talked about. He spoke not of innocence or guilt, but of loyalty, the kind that doesn't come with medals or applause, the kind forged in silence, in sacrifice, in moments when no one's watching and everything is on the line. "You want to know who I really am?" he said, his voice steady, worn at the edges. I'm the guy who carried Jackson 3 clicks through enemy fire because he promised his daughter he'd be home by Christmas. I'm the guy who stayed awake through 40-hour rotations because we didn't have enough boots on the ground. I'm the guy who patched up a kid from the other side because he was still breathing and crying for his mother. He let those words hang in the air, unpolished, unfiltered. The room didn't move. You saw a report, he continued, his eyes locked on one juror, then the next. But I saw men turn into ghosts. I saw boys not even old enough to vote dig holes for their brothers and whisper prayers to no one. You don't forget that. His voice didn't rise. He didn't need to shout. Every word landed like a drop of rain in a drought. Loyalty isn't something you prove. It's something you live. And yeah, I followed an order that day. One I questioned. One I'll regret for the rest of my life, but I took it because 5 lives were on the line, and I'd do it again if it meant they got to come home. His throat tightened, and for the first time, his voice broke. Not loud, but enough to crack through the silence. Corporal Adrian Nunez, he said, beard, the name dropping like stone into still water. None of them recognized it, but Elias did. He was 19, wanted to be a mechanic, said he missed his mom's pancakes more than anything. He died that day, but not because of me, because we were set up to fail. Sent in without backup, with bad intel, and expected to clean it up quietly. His eyes shimmered, but the tears didn't fall. So if you want to call me guilty, fine. Just don't forget the name of the kid who never made it back. As he spoke, the back doors of the courtroom creaked open. The sound was soft, almost swallowed by the heavy silence, but it cut through like a blade. Heads turned instinctively, confusion flickering across faces that had moments ago been locked on Elias. The bailiff shifted uneasily, and even the judge straightened in his seat, frowning. Footsteps echoed against the polished floor, slow and deliberate, each step ringing louder than the last. And then she appeared. A young woman in military uniform, her ribbons modest, her boots dusty, as if she had come straight from a battlefield to this sterile room. Her face was streaked with tears, but her jaw was set, her eyes locked forward with a determination that made the walls seem to lean in closer. In her hand, she clutched a worn photograph, its edges bent, its corners fraying from too much handling. Elias stopped speaking mid-sentence, the words strangling in his throat as his breath caught painfully in his chest. It was her. It was Specialist Maya Grant. He hadn't seen her since the day he pulled her out of that burning convoy, her body broken, her screams muffled by smoke and gunfire. He had carried her half a mile under fire, refusing to leave her behind even when orders came down to withdraw. He thought she hadn't survived. They had told him at debrief she was gone. And yet, here she was, living proof of a truth no one else in this courtroom wanted to hear. The jury leaned forward, whispers breaking out in sharp, disbelieving bursts. The prosecutor rose from his chair, mouth already open to object, but the judge silenced him with a look. All eyes followed Maya as she walked, marched, toward the front of the room. She stopped just a few feet from where Elias stood, and for a moment, the two of them simply stared at each other. The photograph in her hand trembled, but her voice didn't when she spoke. Your Honor, I have testimony that was never allowed to be heard. The judge's brow furrowed deeply, glancing at the defense table, the prosecution, the clock. Procedurally, it was chaos, but something in her presence made it impossible to dismiss. It wasn't just the uniform. It wasn't just the photo. It was the undeniable truth radiating from her, raw and unpolished, the kind that didn't need rehearsing. Elias felt a tremor deep in his bones, not of fear, but of something rarer, something he thought he had buried long ago. Hope. She stood before the judge, voice shaking but clear, and told a story the prosecution had buried. She spoke not like someone trying to impress or convince, but like someone who had carried too much truth in silence for far too long. Specialist Maya Grant stood at attention, her frame rigid with the discipline drilled into her, but her words carried the weight of raw memory, of nights she still woke up screaming from. Sergeant Ward didn't abandon his post, she began, her gaze sweeping the room, daring anyone to challenge her. He didn't pull the trigger out of rage or recklessness. He saved us, all of us. She clutched the photo tighter, the corners digging into her palm like a tether. The mission went south because of bad intel. They told us we were entering a safe zone. It wasn't. It was an ambush. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on, stronger with every word. Command froze. Communications jammed. No backup, no medevac. We were on our own, pinned down, outnumbered. She turned, locking eyes with the jury, those 12 faces that had been so sure of their judgment just hours ago. Sergeant Ward had one shot, one impossible shot. The man he neutralized wasn't an innocent. He was carrying the detonator that would have taken all of us out. She inhaled sharply, her hands trembling, but she refused to waver. Ward radioed in for permission. He waited. He asked twice. The order finally came from above. Take the shot. But when command realized the optics, when they saw the headlines waiting to be written, they needed someone to blame. And they picked the man who had done exactly what he was ordered to do. The courtroom sat in stunned silence, every word slicing through the narrative they had been fed. Elias stood frozen, barely breathing, as if he feared that if he moved, the fragile miracle unfolding before him would shatter. Maya lifted the photograph, an image of their unit, dusty and battered but alive, taken just hours before the ambush. "This is who he saved," she said quietly. "I'm here because of him. We all are." The jury, once so confident, now looked haunted, their certainty unraveling stitch by stitch. The judge leaned back in his chair, brow furrowed deep, weighing the enormity of what he had just heard. Maya's voice dropped lower, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unseen battles. "You were asked to judge a man without being given the truth. Now you have it. Do what's right." She handed over the photo, proof of the mission, of Elias's sacrifice, of what he had lost to protect people who would never even know his name. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed it in the clerk's grasp, and the entire courtroom seemed to lean forward as if the truth itself had taken physical form. The judge motioned for the clerk to bring it to him, his face set, but his eyes betraying the gravity of what he already knew was happening. As the judge studied the image, the jury watched with wide, haunted eyes. It wasn't a perfect picture. It was grainy, taken in the haze of battle, dust clinging to every surface, blood staining uniforms. But there, at the center of it all, stood Elias, weapon lowered, shielding the wounded with his own body, his face a map of exhaustion and defiance, caught in the act of doing exactly what they had accused him of destroying. Around him, other soldiers huddled, some injured, some still firing, but all alive. And beyond them, just visible in the background, a figure blurred by the smoke. The man with the detonator, the one Elias had taken down before the world could turn to ash. It wasn't clean, it wasn't simple. War never was. But it was enough to crack the certainty that had sealed his fate. The jurors, one by one, looked at the photo, then at Elias, then at each other, the weight of doubt growing heavier with every heartbeat. They had been so sure, so ready to believe the easiest story. Now they couldn't look at him the same way. Not as a villain, not as a traitor, but as what he had been all along, a soldier caught in the worst moment of his life, making an impossible decision so that others might live to question it. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably at his table, his stack of papers suddenly looking small and brittle under the light of the truth that had stormed its way into the room. The defense attorney, who had fought a losing battle from the beginning, sat back slowly, the hint of a broken smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Elias stood silently, still cuffed, still in chains, but for the first time, he felt something crack open inside him. Not the old bitterness, not the familiar hollowness, but a glimmer of something different. Something he hadn't dared feel in a long time. Vindication was too loud a word. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of someone finally seeing him. Not the headline, not the rumor, but him. And it was enough to breathe again. The judge called an emergency recess, his voice sharp but heavy, cutting through the thick air of the courtroom. The sound of it snapped the room into a frenzy. Lawyers scrambled from their tables, their whispers slicing the silence like knives, papers rustling, phones buzzing quietly as they tried to piece together a strategy for a case they thought was already won. The prosecution huddled tightly, their confidence cracked wide open, urgency dripping from every frantic glance they cast toward the judge. Meanwhile, the jury sat frozen, pale and shaken, the weight of doubt pressing down harder with every breath they took. Some avoided Elias's gaze entirely, staring at the wood grain of the jury box like it could somehow erase the choice they had made. Others stared at him openly now, not with disdain, but with something close to guilt. The room was alive with a different kind of energy. No longer the smug certainty of a courtroom sealing a man's fate, but the uneasy shifting of truth rising up from where it had been buried. And through it all, Elias stood quietly, his body still, his face unreadable, no longer needing to defend himself, no longer needing to shout or plead or explain. The truth, finally given breath and voice, was walking its own path now, and he trusted it in a way he hadn't trusted anything in a long, long time. He glanced toward Maya, standing rigid near the front, her hands clasped tight behind her back, her chin lifted despite the wet streak still marking her cheeks. She caught his eye for just a second and nodded, a small, almost imperceptible thing, but it hit him harder than any verdict ever could. She had given him something no courtroom, no lawyer, no speech ever could. She had given him back his honor. The judge disappeared into chambers, the bailiff closing the heavy door behind him with a soft click, leaving the rest of the room in a strange, waiting silence. Time dragged. Minutes stretched into an hour, the tension grinding against the walls until it became its own living thing. But Elias didn't move. He stood rooted where he was, head high, not in arrogance but in quiet defiance against the shame they had tried to chain him with. Win or lose, he had spoken the truth. He had stood when it would have been easier to fall. And as he waited for the judge to return, for the jury to reconsider the weight of their choice, Elias Ward knew one thing with absolute certainty. They couldn't unhear what had been said. They couldn't unsee what had been shown. And whatever came next, he was no longer alone. Hours later, the judge returned, his voice somber, carrying the gravity of the moment in every deliberate step he took back to the bench. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the kind that didn't breathe, the kind that held its breath waiting for history to shift. He shuffled the papers in front of him, glancing once at Elias, once at Maya, and then back at the courtroom packed with too many people who now realized they had almost witnessed a terrible mistake written in ink that would have been impossible to erase. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with the cold, detached tone of authority Elias had braced for. It was with something quieter, something almost human. Given the new testimony and evidence presented, the judge said, his voice low but clear, this court finds sufficient cause to vacate the conviction of Sergeant Elias Ward pending a full review. A gasp rippled through the room, soft and stunned, and Elias felt the air shift around him as if the walls themselves exhaled. He wasn't free yet, his name wasn't cleared, but the word guilty no longer hung around his neck like a noose. The chains binding his wrists still remained, but the chains around his soul, those unseen, merciless ones, had loosened. For the first time since the gavel first dropped, Elias allowed himself to breathe in something other than anger, other than resignation. It wasn't relief. It was something fiercer, something more fragile. It was hope. He turned slowly to look at Maya, the young woman he had believed he'd failed, the life he thought had been sacrificed for nothing. She stood tall, unwavering, her uniform immaculate even under the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes. Their gazes locked across the room, and she nodded once, firm and deliberate, as if to say, "You were never alone." Elias didn't smile. The moment was too raw, too sacred for anything as simple as that. Instead, he gave her the smallest tilt of his head, a soldier's gesture, a brother-in-arms thanks, the kind of communication born from the battlefield, where words often come too late and mean too little. The judge ordered the bailiff to remove the cuffs, and as the metal clicked away from his skin, Elias felt the weight of years slip just slightly off his shoulders. He rubbed his wrists absently, feeling the blood return to places that had been numb far longer than the time he spent shackled. Freedom was close. It wasn't a gift. It was something fought for, bled for, spoken into existence by those brave enough to stand when silence would have been easier. And Elias Ward, scarred but standing, knew he was ready to carry that cost. As he walked out of the courtroom, no longer in shackles, Elias didn't raise his fists or shout victory. There was no grand display, no need to prove anything to the crowd that lingered just beyond the heavy courthouse doors. The cameras flashed. Reporters called his name, but he kept his head down, his steps steady. Grounded not in triumph, but in something quieter, something more sacred. He simply nodded to the woman standing at the edge of the aisle. Maya, the one whose voice had cut through the noise, the one who had reminded the world, and him, what honor looked like when everything else fell away. She gave him a small, proud smile, and in that silent exchange, something shifted deep in his chest. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out the worn photograph she had given him. The image of dusty faces and battered uniforms, of life hanging by a thread, and the bonds that had been stronger than the war itself. He tucked the photo carefully back into his pocket, close to his heart, where it belonged. And then, without a word, he stepped into the light. The sun hit his face like a baptism, hot and unrelenting, and for a moment he stood there, blinking against the brightness, feeling the weight of years lift, not erased, never erased, but transformed. His record could be rewritten, scrubbed clean by courts and committees, by signatures and seals. But his scars, those were his to keep. The ones on his skin, the ones etched deep into the marrow of who he was, they told a story that no document could erase. And for the first time in a long time, Elias carried them without shame. They weren't marks of failure. They were proof that he had fought, that he had stood when it would have been easier to fall, that he had made choices in the gray where others only saw black and white. He walked past the reporters without slowing, past the curious onlookers, past the system that had tried to bury him. Every step forward was a step claimed, not given. This was a new beginning, not because the world had suddenly become just, but because he had decided that their verdict, their easy labels, didn't get to define him anymore. As he crossed the street and disappeared into the crowd, he carried no bitterness, no fire for revenge. He carried something better, a legacy rebuilt, not on the lies others told, but on the truth he had finally, irrevocably forced them to see.